Well, welcome everybody to Liquefied Natural Gas Hazardous Rail Proposal, our webinar for tonight. And I'm going to dive in, and then I'm going to be followed by Jess Conard, who is from East Palestine, Ohio, and she will be discussing what can go wrong and also proposed Federal Rail Safety Act. And then Annika van Rossum, our Advocacy and Policy Coordinator from Delaware Riverkeeper Network, will be speaking about why the Trump rule did not measure up the first time it was adopted in 2020, what was wrong with it, why it was thrown out for safety reasons. And so at this time, I'd like to dive into just into a couple slides that will show us what is the basics regarding liquefied natural gas. So what is LNG? That's liquefied natural gas, and it's natural gas that's been cooled to a liquid state at about minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit. And they do this for shipping and storage. The volume of natural gas in its liquid state is 600 to 620 times smaller than its volume in its gaseous state. So it makes it easier to transport, but it also makes it more explosive. And we'll hear more about that from Annika van Rossum. It's classified as a hazardous material, it's highly flammable, and it's potentially explosive. If it's released, just a spark will ignite it in minutes, like turning on the ignition in your car or even static electricity. If it is immediately ignited, a hot fire that cannot be extinguished is formed. And the protocol, according to the fire commissioners, is to evacuate, and this is all in a matter of minutes, and let it burn out because you simply cannot put the fire out. Imagine what that would do in a highly densely populated area. If it's not ignited immediately, there's a cold, dense, ground-hugging cloud that can move distances, and it can go down. It's heavier than air, so it can go down into a ditch, it can go into sewers, it can go through tunnels, it can travel over water, and then it can explode. And Annika van Rossum will speak a little bit about that as well. It robs oxygen from the air if you are close to this cloud, so you actually can suffocate within a certain proximity to the cold vapor cloud. The fire can burn back to the source. A fact that was put into the record by Earth Justice, who represented us in litigation fighting the Trump rule, is that 22 rail cars equals the force of a Hiroshima bomb. Next slide, please. So what is the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, proposing? Well, they're basically proposing to relax hazardous material transport rules. And we're going to hear from Jess Conard that they're not good enough as they are. LNG transport by rail car is what they want to do. They want to lift the ban that was adopted to protect public safety. They are invoking Trump's executive orders to unleash American energy and to declare a national energy emergency in order to do this. And some of the language that they're using in the Federal Register are such as eliminate undue burdens on the identification, development, and use of domestic energy resources, and to improve government efficiency. Basically, they're asking the industry to weigh in on the record saying that they want LNG to be moved by rail. Why would they do this? Because it's quicker than building a pipeline. It's something that they would be able to do in a pinch, and they want everything that they can possibly get if they can get it. They also are implying in what they put into the Federal Register that the specification cars, which are called the DOT 113C1 20W9 rail car, is safer than the regular DOT 113 car. And that was disputed, and that was actually not accepted by the court as being true, but they are implying that. So we will, all of us, they want the industry to weigh in, all of us will be weighing in as well in order to set the record straight. Next slide, please. So why are they doing this now? Well, when Trump was elected the first time around, he adopted in 2020 a rule which overturned the longstanding ban on transporting LNG by rail. And that ban was thrown out by the Trump rule, and he instituted basically making it legal. Several environmental groups, Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and 5 other groups represented by Earth Justice and 14 attorneys general challenged that rule back in 2020. When President Biden was elected, he had promised as part of his campaign to do away with the Trump rule and put public safety back on the in priority. So the suspension rule, suspending the Trump rule, was adopted in 2020, but they never got around to adopting the replacement rule, which would have made that permanent. However, we prevailed in court, and the legal challenge that was brought won. And the Trump rule was thrown out by the court after it had wound through the whole legal process in January of 2025. And that means that just last month, PHMSA officially repealed the Trump rule. And now they're very quickly coming in with this new advanced notice of proposed rulemaking saying that they want to basically deregulate. And why is that? Because Trump and the deregulation industry friendly regime is back, and that's what they do. Next slide, please. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Jess Conard. And she's, as I said, from East Palestine, Ohio, and she's going to walk us through disaster averted. Jess?
Thank you so much, Tracy. My name is Jess Conard. I am a former resident of East Palestine, Ohio. I titled my slide presentation Disaster Averted and in parentheses almost because the vinyl chloride disaster in East Palestine was considered a success by those who carried it out. So almost diverted and a disaster. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about preventing rail and chemical disasters in your community. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I have done is prior to the disaster in my community, I was a medical speech language pathologist for 15 years. So I've managed to turn my advocacy into a career. So this is my financial disclosures page. I am the Appalachia Director for Beyond Plastics. I am also a digital campaign fellow for Halt the Harm, and I am a speaker and member of Physicians and Scientists Network Addressing Plastic and Health, also known as PSNAP. But otherwise, I am here in my capacity as a displaced East Palestine, Ohio resident. And that's a picture of me at the Ohio Capitol building advocating for my community a couple years ago. Next slide, please. The agenda or the objective of my presentation today is to talk to you a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned about in East Palestine. I'll talk a little bit about the history of hazardous rail transport, and then we will turn that into the NTSB or National Transportation Safety Board recommendations and compare that to the Railway Safety Act of 23 and then 25. Next slide, please. So I'm sure you've all seen this photo, and if you haven't, there it is, the infamous black plume that I could see from my backyard. This is West Martin Street. My brother's house is just to the left of this photo, and I used to live down on the corner of down the hill there, and rode my bike on this street many times. So this is home, or was home, and one of the questions that I still ask myself, because I do frequent the community, is when you're still detecting toxic chemicals in your yard, how do you just move on? I will explain to you why this relates to LNG here in a few minutes, but most importantly, wanted to point out that there were 31 recommendations after the train derailment in East Palestine that were made from the National Transportation Safety Board. Most notably, the wheel bearing defect detector, which is what caused the fire, which is what caused the train to derail. Tank car modernization, phasing out of DOT 111 cars, which is one of the cars that was punctured, which contributed to the fire. Onboard voice and data recording was recommended, emergency responder training, and hazardous communication, which the polluter promised to provide first responder training and did not. And then as well as federal rulemaking, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is sort of in the works, sort of not. I think also notably, you should be aware that there are currently 244 open NTSB rail recommendations that have not been fulfilled, and 29 of of them are specifically related to hazardous materials and track safety. And then additionally, a pretty large portion remain just partially implemented. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit word heavy, and I don't tend to do this, but I think it's really important to point out some of the more prominent rail disasters that we have already experienced, and they go back many decades, but I just decided to start with 1978 in Waverly, Tennessee. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'm happy to share these slides with you if you want to look into them. The point about this is that East Palestine, Ohio, the derailment and the chemical disaster is not an isolated incident. It is one of many. And the only opportunities that we have had legislatively is reactively. So we need to really start thinking about proactive decisions because that is what will save lives. We know that rail incidents have revealed persistent weaknesses in rail safety, and that could be from aging tank cars or inadequate maintenance, insufficient emergency response, chemical route disclosures or lack thereof. And so these legislative and regulatory advancements they're really limited. They have improved some tank car standards, accessible, effective trainings at the corporate level, a couple of different stricter crew protocols, but we still have these disasters. And so we really need to dive into those proactive rail reforms. They're still very needed and still possible when you have the right funding to do that. I will note while we're here, these disasters specifically, I just want to kind of compare to the recommendations from East Palestine. So the NTSB for the Waverly disaster recommended trainings as well as the tank design upgrades. And so this did trigger the Tennessee Hazmat Institute to offer some training programs, and it did influence a federal placarding law. And then a year after this, FEMA was formed. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. Graniteville, sort of similar, mechanical recommendations, improving a switch and some outdated procedures and inspection traceability. And then this also led the FRA or Federal Railroad Administration, some safety advisories. So, again, you have kind of this formulation of different boards, different advisories, different response teams, different training programs. The problem is that you're not preventing the disaster from actually happening. So these implementation of these programs, in order for them to be worth anything, they have to be effective. And then Paulsboro, if you're familiar, that was another vinyl chloride incident. The NTSB again recommended better crew training. Bridge inspections is a huge one when it comes to rail. If you haven't seen RP3's report from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, those bridges, there weren't that many of them that got assessed, but the report it's staggering how awful those bridges are. And also, obviously, East Palestine, which I already talked about, the defect detectors, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those look like in action. But basically, the same thing keeps happening. So we need to put these rail reforms into place. Next slide, please. So again, safety has persistently been rolled back, or it has been delayed, or it has been ignored before the incident actually happens. So in terms of hazardous rail, train derailments do happen 3 times a day. Now, that's not necessarily disasters like the magnitude of East Palestine or in some of the other disasters, but the fact that it's possible to have those 3 times a day makes adding LNG to rail a very, very bad idea. So again, a lot of those hazards in rail are, because they're transported in rail cars that have known weaknesses in crashes like the DOT 111 and DOT 117 tank cars. Some of the tank cars actually lack sufficient puncture resistance. So any derailment that would be over 17 miles per hour, some of those cars are not puncture resistant to anything over 17 miles per hour. I don't know about you, but most of the trains that have gone through my community go much faster than that. The major railroads have cut staff by over 30%. And I was at a rail safety meeting in my community this weekend where one of the minor railroads said that they had to cut staff up to 40%. And I just think that, with all the safety issues and the derailments that we have, cutting staff is like the last thing that I would want to happen. A lot of the trains now exceed 2 miles in length. And if you think about what it takes to look behind you as someone who's running a train and look 2 miles behind you and make sure that everything is running smoothly, it's nearly impossible. And then you add in a train track that's not, forward or straight. You have, a lot of curves in the track, a lot of uphills, downhills. It makes it pretty much impossible to manage. Many of the local fire departments, specifically those located in rural areas where the train is running, they really just don't have that specialized training and equipment for hazardous rail incidents, even though we have all of these recommendations from the NTSB, encouraging those systems to improve. Like I said, there are 12,000 hazardous material rail incidents in the 10 years between 2012 and 2022. And then lastly, I think it's really important to understand that there is very little municipal control when it comes to a railroad coming through your community. The local government has zero authority to restrict hazardous cargo passing through. Most notably, one of the reasons why the East Palestine train, the freight train, was pushed through, why that evacuation was lifted, is because you actually can't run a train through an evacuation zone. So the tracks were still burnt, they were still smoking. You could still see fire, and there were trains running through, and the evacuation was lifted. So I can't imagine that was safe by any means. And if you remember too, it took about a month, almost 30 days, before they decided to go back in and clean up the 116,000 gallons of vinyl chloride and the 60,000 gallons of proprietary blend lube oil. 30 days and a lot of persistence from the community. And then lastly, railroads are actually they're not required to notify the communities about any hazardous shipments unless if there is a spill. 70% of these derailments occur in cities, and I think that's also just really staggering. So adding LNG to the rail is a very bad idea. Industry proposals right now have called for between 80 and 100 LNG tank cars per train. That's a long train, and that's a lot of energy being transported by rail. Right now, with the current data, being that train derailments happen 3 times a day, we can reasonably predict that an LNG, even just a minor incident, would happen 1 to 5 times per year while transporting LNG, and then a major derailment every 5 to 10 years. So it's really important that we start pushing through legislation that makes sense, given that, we have these releases and in these potentially in residential areas and at crossings. So we'll kind of dive into the Rail Safety Act now. Next slide, please. All right, so let's get rail. Kidding. If I don't laugh, I might cry some days. So with this, this chart is the green lights on the left are all of the recommendations from the National Transportation Safety Board that have come out of the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment and chemical disaster. So number 1, the wayside defect detectors, the phasing out of the inadequate tank cars, the crew size. And then in the middle there, you can see that is the original Railway Safety Act of 2023 that was sponsored by Senator Brown and former junior Senator Vance, who is now our vice president. It didn't really have a ton of the recommendations. There were only 4 of those recommendations, kind of those main ones that were added. And Rep. Deluzio, who I almost met on Saturday, unfortunately missed him by about 20 minutes. Along with some other folks, are sponsoring the 2025 version, which does add in a lot of those missing elements. Some of those elements are still watered down. So, for example, the length of space between the wayside defect detectors, while it is improved, with this new legislation, it still would not have prevented the disaster in East Palestine. So again, it seems like, we've got green lights on more green lights on the right. It's very watered down, and a lot of the language is not very tight, like what we'd really like to see. So next slide. So is it enough? No. Future disasters, unfortunately, are still going to happen. And I think most importantly, we have to understand that none of this legislation has actually passed. We're still talking about it. And we've seen at the federal level how quickly things can get pushed through. They can really hammer out some of these really big, expensive bills that really aren't to the benefit of too many of us. But yet things like this that make sense is this common sense legislation that will protect lives, protect workers, and protect our economy. I can't imagine the disaster in East Palestine was good for the polluter, for that corporation. So is it enough? No, we're still going to have these future disasters. We still have, missing mandatory recording devices, standardized chemical hazard communication protocols, and regulatory reporting oversight. I know that this is a really commonly reported fact that 22 rail cars of LNG hold the same amount of energy as the Hiroshima bomb. But I wanted to just show that in height comparisons because I remember what it was like to look out my window on my front porch and see that big black plume in just covering my community. And that is nothing. It is puny compared to the Hiroshima bomb. So on the left, you have the East Palestine vinyl chloride plume coming in at about 10,000 feet. You've got Mount Everest coming in around 30,000. A commercial airliner usually can fly right around 35,000, and then the Hiroshima bomb at 50,000. So 22 rail cars. And in case if you forgot, the legislative push is between 80 and 100 rail cars of LNG. So this is just a really bad idea, especially when we can predict that rail incidents happen 3 times a day. So that concludes my slides. If you want to go to the last slide, that's my son and I. I put him on my slideshows just to show that he's such a good kid, and he was diagnosed with asthma following the derailment and the chemical disaster. We don't have a history of that. It's not generational. But he's like one of the most popular 4-year-olds. I think at the time, he's 5 now. He was on the cover of New York Times, or the front page of New York Times and Bloomberg and all sorts of things. And so he's kind of my little buddy that I like to just give a picture into what it would be like to be in one of these disasters. And it does impact you directly. So even if you don't live near a rail line, I'm sure you know somebody who does. So really important to continue to stay up on this. But happy to talk more. I do have a website if you want to check that out, or shoot me an email and I'd be happy to connect. With that, will pass it over to Annika.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about some of the safety issues that were pointed out with the proposed rule originally, but I'm going to be referencing it in terms of the U.S. Court of Appeals decision by the District of Columbia that happened in January. So these will be some safety concerns that were pointed out by the court and were part of their decision to deny the PHMSA rule. So, and I'm Annika with Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and Tracy put my email in the chat. So if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to shoot them over to me and Tracy as well. So next slide. So first, just to give folks a little bit of an idea. So when you transport LNG, you have to cool it down. And so LNG is a methane gas. So that in itself makes it a harmful air pollutant and of course a powerful greenhouse gas. So naturally in things like this, there are always opportunities for the gas to escape or leak or something like that. So there is always that potential danger. But in order to liquefy the gas, you have to cool it down to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Some articles will say 259 degrees. So in that range. And as you can see here, you know, when you have gas, it's kind of floating around. It takes up more space. When you have it as a liquid, it will take up less space than the gas. But part of that problem obviously is that when if it starts to heat back up in that container, it will expand, as we all know from middle school science classes. Gas does expand. So these tanks are designed to try to keep everything cool, but things can happen, and so that does propose a danger when you have more going in. And they of course do also have to use energy to heat that back up into a gas. So that was one of the concerns as well, because if there's anything that goes wrong in these tank cars, if you have an issue, if you have a failure of cooling, you do risk these tanks starting to, if the gas heats up, these tanks starting to expand, and you do risk an explosion as the pressure builds with that. And so should the gas be exploded, should there be something like that, you have what's called a conflagration, which is essentially just a really, really large explosion that damages property and land and people. And that can burn at 2,426 degrees Fahrenheit. And just to put that in perspective, the melting point of iron is about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're not too far off there from that temperature. So that's, of course, immensely dangerous, could hurt so many people, could hurt property, could hurt land, all of that. And then another issue is if it doesn't ignite but does leak out of the container, you have kind of a low ground hugging, ultra cold gas cloud. And so that can spread over a wide area. And the problem with that is that you can actually cause severe burns, because we are talking about a super, super, super cold gas. So if any of you were ever near dry ice and were of course told not to touch it because you would burn yourself, this is exactly what that would be like. And then if the gas were to get into an enclosed space, you do risk people asphyxiating and dying from that, because it will rob the oxygen out of that room. So those are that's one of the first set of safety concerns that were pointed out by the court in their decision. The next set, if we go to the next slide. So specifically the type of car that was proposed to be transported via rail is this DOT 113C120W9 that Tracy was talking about earlier. In the decision, they mostly reference them as in the class of DOT 113 cars, which originally were not designed for cryogenic material, cryogenic transport. And so the idea behind these cars, though, is that they are essentially a tank within a tank. So there's an inner shell and an outer shell that should technically make it harder for things to go out. But of course, again, we're talking about such a very volatile substance. We are talking about things failing. We are talking about risks. And with everything like that, we do know there are issues. So they were classified for cryogenics, but not for these large volumes of LNG. And so one of the things that was brought up with these cars by PHMSA was that they had an excellent safety record through 50 years of service, and during which time they were just used to mostly transport ethylene, which is another flammable cryogenic liquid, which shares chemical and operating properties that are similar with LNG, and that's what they talk about. And so the proposed rule mentioned that in the 15 years of these being operated, there was an excellent safety record, as they said. But you did actually have 14 instances of damage occurring. 3 of those instances did have cargo escape because of a breach of both the outer and the inner tanks. And then in another 3 of those instances, cargo escape because of a failure of the valves or fittings. So nothing is perfect, nothing is foolproof. So we saw that happen even with these cars that were part of this excellent safety record. And one of the things that was mentioned in the decision was that given the small number of DOT 113 tank cars in use, but given these 14 documented incidences, with the 3 of them being shell breaches, and these incidences are between about the 1980s and 2017, the court said that that's not a compelling safety record. So even though PHMSA was trying to say, well, this is excellent, this is great, they said, no, that's not. Given that timeline, that amount of instances and how little these cars are used, that's really not compelling proof that these are super duper high standard of safety. And again, too, we have the National Transportation Safety Board had concerns over these 14 incidences and said that that was not a safety record that they should be touting as so wonderful. And so it was also acknowledged that despite the low probability of rail incidents, there can be these are high consequence events. And given the quantities of the hazardous materials in transportation, that's also something that they took into consideration, that if the argument at the time was trying to be that the risk is so low, but what the court pointed out is, sure, the risk might be low, but when we see these happen, when these events do happen, because they do happen, the consequences are super high, as you also heard Jess talk about with East Palestine. So if we go to the next slide. And something that can happen, and this will kind of tie back to the cars, is you do see something called a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, or a BLEV. And so that's actually not triggered by ignition, but does occur when a pressurized container is breached and the contents are then exposed to outside heat with no pressure relief. And that causes the materials inside the tank to actually start to boil and start to heat up. And that is when you can actually have the container explode. And so again, on top of that, you have pieces flying out of the place. Who knows what's going out there? Again, we do have the issues of then if it were to ignite, we have that dangerous fire. If it doesn't ignite, it's going to stick to the ground. And it is considered one of the most devastating major hazards. It burns, like Tracy talked about earlier, it will burn very, very hot, very fast, and very wide. And then also these safety trainings, this isn't something that's super standard for firefighters to learn about. There are special techniques and special trainings when it comes to handling these types of explosions. And so to put that in perspective for you, another one of the safety concerns that came along because of these types of incidents is that the LNG proposed rule did not impose a mandatory speed limit on trains carrying, on the number of cars for the trains to carry the LNG. And there wasn't necessarily a minimum or an imposed number of cars. They relied on a non-binding and recommended speed limit of no more than 50 miles per hour if you had 20 or more cars of hazardous materials. There are documented breaches, though, of incidences happening below 50 miles per hour. And there was at least one company or one instance of it being touted to get, I believe the number was about 80 cars attached to one train. And again, when we're talking about this, one of the things that the court did have to consider is that if you don't have a minimum or a standard safety speed limit, the faster these cars go, the larger a problem you're going to have and the more likelihood of a breach should there be a derailment. So even if you only had 5 cars on a train, the fact that there was no binding required maximum safety speed limit, if you had a car going way too fast, you are still increasing the risk of puncture, you are increasing derailment issues, and that is going to be a huge problem if that were to happen. And so for my last slide, part of the concerns as well for denying the LNG rule on LNG by rail was what this does also mean for the environment and what that does happen, because obviously people are going to get hurt. We are going to have those kinds of issues. But the court said a derailment, while it does again pose a low probability but a high consequence risk, that could harm the environment. So all these events that I've talked about don't just affect people, but of course we have burning of trees, we have hurting of wildlife, we have possible contamination, any sort of derailment or puncture or issue with the tank cars could have serious implications on the environment. And the court said that this low probability that was basically being touted by PHMSA was insufficient to support a finding of no significant impact under the precedents. And again, one of the things that the court wanted to remind them was the agency cannot use minimal past harm. So they're saying because there hasn't been so many of these incidents, that's why they should be allowed to do these cars for this different purpose. So the court said just because you've had minimal past harm doesn't mean you can depart from standard practice. And one of the things that they pointed out that had to be considered was, are you having lacking or are you not having these dangerous incidents because of site-specific factors that are going on with the cars, or because of sheer luck that it just hasn't happened? Basically point out that there's not enough proof, there's not enough backing that says the practices that were put in place, the standards put in place, the issues in the proposed rule would actually ensure that we wouldn't have more of these incidents. That the only reason we haven't had them so far is really, you have to ask the question, is it because of what's just going on in the world? Is it just the sheer luck that we haven't run into those problems? So that was the big thing, was the court pointed out a lot of issues that we do see, concerns that you do see with LNG in this transportation, but also the fact that there really wasn't enough proof being given that this is a safe way to transport LNG, to do it by rail, to do it in these cars, to do it through communities. So those are some of the big ones. And you can read that decision if you want to get more. It's only 24 pages, so it's a good read for anybody if you'd like to learn a little bit more. And with that, I will turn it back over to Tracy.
Thank you, Annika. And thank you, Jess. So I'd like to welcome everyone back. Here we are, and we'd like to open it up to questions and answers. And I know we have a couple of them already in the Q&A box. If you have any other questions, please put them into the Q&A. You want to go ahead and start, Annika, with the ones that we already have in there?
Yeah, so one of the questions is, are we talking about Canadian or American LNG?
Yeah, we're talking about American LNG. Now, it's a good question, because if it's made legal in the United States, would they try to bring LNG in from Canada? It's not legal now to transport LNG by rail car. So we are talking about American LNG. In Pennsylvania, the second greatest natural gas producer of all of the states, second only to Texas, a lot of this LNG would most likely be produced by increasing fracking in wells in Pennsylvania. Of course, Ohio and West Virginia, all of them are Marcellus Shale and the Utica Shale. In the Midwest as well, we have a lot of methane that's being produced either as byproduct from fracking from oil, or for fracking for gas itself. So we would probably, if this were made legal, you would see it pretty quickly in Pennsylvania. And one of the reasons for that is one of the companies that asked for this to occur is a company that wanted to use LNG by rail car as its means of transport to get it to the Delaware River for export overseas from the proposed Gibbstown LNG export terminal. That project has not moved ahead. It isn't totally dead. It's sort of like a zombie at this point. But bottom line is that the company called it a virtual pipeline and said it was quicker than building a pipeline and going through all the approvals that they would have to get under Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and PHMSA. So as far as, it's the transport of LNG, we're really would see this throughout the entire United States. It would remove the barrier that now keeps companies from doing this. Now, I would like to point out just one thing. under the current regulations, and this has been in place forever, a company could always go for what's called a special permit. And they could get this special permit in order to move LNG by rail. And that's what the New Fortress Energy Company did to try to get the LNG down to Gibbstown. They were going to liquefy it out in north central Pennsylvania, put it in rail cars, send it over 200 miles across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, down along the Delaware River to Gibbstown, which is in South Jersey, and then send it overseas for sale. And this is what most and in the end, the special permit was not extended by PHMSA. We fought that, and PHMSA did not allow them to re-up or extend that permit, so it was canceled. But a company could go in and do that today, but they have to meet certain requirements in order to be able to get approval to do that.
Another question is, would some of these tank cars be privately owned?
Well, in terms of private ownership, I mean, typically these companies that want to move, like for instance, New Fortress Energy, or when the Trump rule was actually adopted and in place for a while, no company actually had them built, but because there's no specification cars that met the Trump rule requirements. There was only a prototype built. You saw a picture of that, but it was never used. So no company actually invested in building these specification cars. That would be a modification of the DOT 113. So if they were to build them, they might privately own them. But typically what happens is the tracks are owned by one company, then another company uses those tracks, like Conrad, or some of the Conrail, I'm sorry, and some of these other companies that Norfolk Southern that transport. So maybe Jess or Annika want to add to that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. One of the things that I did learn throughout my advocacy journey is that there are some rail cars that are owned by the railroad, and that there are some privately owned rail cars. And then there are leased tank cars or rail cars. And so these are generally marked. So the rail cars that are owned by the railroad usually have the code for the railroad. So like Norfolk Southern might say NS, or CSX might say CSX. And then the privately owned ones usually have the last letter as a letter X. One of the ones that I see a lot of is GAT with an X. So that's sort of how you know if they are privately owned. And a lot of the privately owned ones are like the chemical companies or the energy companies. And then the ones that are leased could be any company, and it could be marked by a very specific or specialized code. But I would venture to say that most of the freight rail cars, at least the ones that go through or used to go through my backyard, were marked as private. And those are your chemical companies.
Thank you, Jess.
Great. Obviously I don't have anything to add to any of that. Another question is, understanding this is a disaster in the making, what are the arguments for using rail cars to transport LNG? Why is this a priority for the Trump administration, and are there any benefits?
Well, I'll just address it based on what they have in the Federal Register as what they're asking energy companies, rail companies to tell them. Basically, they're saying, well, we want to know if there are companies out there that want to use LNG rail cars. They're asking basically in this advanced rulemaking for feedback from companies about whether or not they actually want to use it. So they do not present an argument, accept the argument that there needs to be, that there's an energy emergency under the Trump EO executive order, and that we need to unleash America energy as the reason. So there's no substantive reason beyond that. You can read those executive orders to see what the language is there, but they're basically asking companies to tell them, first, is there a current or potential future market for permits to transport LNG by rail, tank car? Second, is there a current market demand to transport other flammable cryogenic materials? And they mention things such as ethylene built in these specification cars. And then that's where they imply here that, remember that these specification cars are characterized as having a minimum wall thickness on the outer jacket shell, and the outer jacket heads must be no less than 9/16. In other words, they're saying, and on, they describe this spec car, but basically they're saying, and there was a proposal made to try to develop a more safe car. Now, bottom line is that a company would want to use this in order to be able to quickly throw LNG on the rail and get it somewhere. I mean, that's really what this is all about. And if they deregulate these hazardous rail transportation regulations, then they would be able to do that, assuming we wouldn't be able to overturn them in court again. But in terms of, exactly what why they're proposing this, they really don't give any more substance to their arguments, other than the fact that they want to unleash American energy, that there is an emergency. And we feel that what we really see here is always a push by the industry to try to get material on the rails that they can move quickly. And yes, they have to build spec cars in order to do it, and that would be an investment. But still, compared to what they would have to do in order to build a pipeline and to operate a pipeline, many of these companies may very well feel that LNG by rail would be less expensive. And there's much less regulation in terms of, what you could actually transport, when you can transport it. You heard from Jess, how the regulations are very lax. Communities have absolutely no control over what goes through their community. And when we were fighting the LNG by rail special permit, everyone said, well, why can't we just stop it? Well, that's because the federal government has jurisdiction and the local government doesn't. Even the city of Philadelphia could say nothing about it, even though it went right through their community. And when we did out the 2-mile buffer on either side, we saw that more than 1 million people of the along the rail tracks would be impacted should there be an accident. So we're really talking about tremendous impact, but we're talking about very little regulation. And I think that's probably what the industry would say about why they would want to move forward. Jess or Annika, would you like to add to that?
I can add, I agree with what you're saying, Tracy, and just want to add that the thought that we don't create enough energy to use here is completely false, and that's because we are exporting a large amount of our energy. And what Tracy was saying, if I understand correctly, is that we have to transport this energy across the country, and it's easier and cheaper to transport it in rail than it is to build a new pipeline infrastructure. So the exporting of the gas is contributing to the rising of domestic costs. So not only is it making someone else money, it's costing us more money. And the reason that these bomb trains are, being proposed is really just to get it to the coast so that it can be exported easier and make money. So it's the thought that we don't create or generate enough energy for our own use, that, we have these blackouts and things like that. If we're exporting our energy, then we have an overabundance of it. And this is really just to make more money, to unleash it to other countries so that big corporations can take advantage of that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, if you read a lot of the things they just talk about, that they try to do it by rail because they say there's limitations with pipelines and that this would help them meet their greater demand. But as you've heard, there's not, yeah. So
Yeah,
another, yeah.
I was
Go ahead.
just going to add, I think it's a very good point that, you know, we're saying that there, Trump administration is invoking the executive orders, but let's all remember there is not an energy emergency except what's been created by the industry itself. And they're just looking for more markets. And this LNG by rail would be used for export. And lots of times the industry will say, well, we want to move it, you know, from Pennsylvania to New England. You know, they're already doing that by truck. That is legal to move LNG by truck. And in small amounts, it's very, very different than an 80 to 100 car, what they call a unit train, which basically is a bomb many times over when you consider those 22 rail cars. So this energy emergency fallacy that is being put forward by the Trump administration is obviously not true. We all know that, but it is being used to argue for a lot of the additional fracking that that companies want, and for the development of fossil fuel industries, which of course are polluting and killing us, have had tremendous human health harms and environmental harms that will go far beyond our generation. So we want to stop this. We want renewable energy to replace the fossil fuel developments, and to actually use these executive orders, which are fantasies in themselves, as a reason to put forward a deregulation of hazardous material on rails is just totally unacceptable and really reckless and ridiculous. And that's why we have to fight it. That's why we have to get comments into the record. We're going to have a slide at the end about how to put comments into the record. The record will close on August 4th, and it's really important that we load it up with the reasons that we do not want LNG to be moved by rail car.
Another question is, will they have to publish the routes of these trains if it happens?
No, both Jess and I are shaking our heads. No, they don't. As a matter of fact, we tried to get that information when we were fighting the LNG by rail special permit that would go through Pennsylvania. And it's considered to be protected information. You can't get it. Now, there were some states when LNG by rail was made legal under the HMR, the hazardous material regulations for rail under Trump. And some states did say that they would disclose that information, but it was piecemeal and you had to file, you know, a right to know. But it was just a small handful. Generally, you cannot find that information out. And even the towns who have these rail cars going through them do not know what's coming and when it's coming. And I think Jess explained that very well with what happened in East Palestine. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know when it was going to start again. And this is exactly the situation that we would be set. Everybody would be sitting not knowing whether or not there is an LNG train coming through their community or not, and when it would come, if it would.
There is no public information on the actual cargo that's being transported, but you can look up the train tracks and you can look up where the manufacturing facilities exist and where the export facilities are. And you can map it out on your own and you can pay attention in your community. I mean, this is kind of a cool thing that we could do as watchdogs, as community watchdogs, is, you know, having folks like, what's on this train, and having people report what they're seeing or taking photos. And we could figure that out and we could map that out. There are a significant amount of security risks, I think, too, that come with this. I'm sure that terrorists would love to know that there's a bomb train headed through a specific community with, you know, a specific person that's going to be there, a specific convention or whatever it is. So, you know, there are specific security risks that I think come with that. But you know, again, this is putting communities at risk. This is preventing, you know, informed emergency planning. I think the other thing too is that there is an app called Ask Rail that is potentially available. I think it's a paid app for first responders that does provide more of like just real-time content of what's coming through. Like if there is a disaster, they can go to that app and figure out what was on the train. The problem is that when you have a derailment, everything's just like mangled and it's all just kind of in a block, like they're not in order anymore. So even when you have the manifest, and a lot of the placards are melted off, which was the problem we had in East Palestine too. So, I think not knowing it is a real problem. It's a safety issue on multiple ends.
There's a bunch more questions, but I don't know if Tracy, you want to do the last slide or if you want me to ask another question.
Yeah, I think we probably we want to end at 8 o'clock on time because we want to honor everybody's time. We really appreciate everyone joining here tonight. And we are going to be making a recording and sending it out to everybody. And we'll share some of the links that were discussed tonight. But I'd like to get the last slide up there so you can know about the upcoming deadline for the comment, which is at midnight on August 4th. And again, we'll send this link out. So Annika is also putting it into the chat. You can go to our website, Delaware Riverkeeper Network's website, in order to find out talking points, and there's a sample letter, and there's a link to show you how to submit it to PHMSA. Also, Karen Feriden's group, Better Path Coalition, has a really great easy form, and you can fill that out. Go to that second link, and Annika also put that into the chat, and that form gets submitted, allows your comment to be submitted very quickly by the person who receives it after you fill it out. So that easy form is available. It's very quick, and it also has sample talking points that we all have shared amongst ourselves. We have a coalition of groups that are working on this, and Action Network and Power New Jersey have all been, and groups across Pennsylvania. Halt the Harm has been advertising this. So we really hope that people will make the time to take a few minutes to use the sample talking points, put them in the template, and click it and send it out. We need to tell PHMSA that the public does not want this. It's very important for us to speak up. Right now, most of all the comments are opposing it, but have no fear. The industry will be loading it up as we get closer to August 4th with their arguments about why they want it. So we have to counter that, and we have to show that the public does not want this to occur. Also, you can read the PHMSA proposal and at that link there, and it's a very far-reaching proposal about what PHMSA is saying they want to do. It covers a whole bunch of things, and you really have to scroll down to the end in order to see the one section that has to do with LNG by rail, and it's under topics of consideration. I put that in the chat earlier when Gail was asking about it, or when Bob was asking about it. And it is number 24, and that's what I had read earlier, the things that they're asking there. But they also ask in the general discussion of this deregulation effort on the part of PHMSA, what are the safety implications? So load it up with what the safety implications are for your community and what you think about this kind of thing going through your community. And always put an opening sentence that is personal. And the reason that is, and a closing sentence, the reason that's really important is PHMSA just counts it as sort of a form letter unless you personalize it. So make sure you always put something like, I am so-and-so, I live here, or me and my family live here, and I do not want this, or I want to bring this to your attention. But something very personal in the beginning so they can see this is an individual, a real person commenting. So the next thing that would happen after this advance notice would be that PHMSA would take this information that they receive, and then they may come back out with an actual rulemaking. And in the rulemaking, it would be similar to what they put forward when the Trump rule was proposed in 2019 and then adopted in 2020. And that is they had technical specifications for what the car would look like, what the valves would look like. They had certain conditions that they were requiring that were different from what was in place originally, like if you were to go for a special permit, for instance. So they were saying this was going to make it safe. Of course, as you heard from Annika, it doesn't make it safe, and the court agreed with us. But we want everyone to realize that the next step would be an actual rulemaking, and then everybody would be able to comment on the specifics of what they're actually proposing to do. So stay alert, listen for this as we go forward, but try right now to take the time to put a comment in on August 4th, before August 4th. And I want to thank Jess Conard. Jess, thank you very much for joining us. I know it has been a trauma for you and your community, and we really appreciate you sharing that with us, and also the learning that you have done as an advocate and has shared with others. Thank you. It's really important, and we really, really appreciate it. Annika, I want to thank you for digging into the court ruling and finding out why the Trump rule was not acceptable. That is a great lesson for us in terms of what to say about any future rulemaking that will come down the road. So please dig in if you can. And I'd like to thank Peter Tran, who's our IT guru, who has kept us going here tonight. And I would like to thank all of you, because it's really important that people then share this information outward, even if those who were registered and were not able to join tonight are going to get a recording. Share it out and ask people with the comment link that we're going to be sending to take a few minutes to submit a comment to PHMSA. So I'm sorry we went over 4 minutes, and I said I was going to honor 8 o'clock. But thank you, everybody, and we greatly appreciate it.